Good morning, everyone, and well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure for having you all attend this lecture. Again, my name is Robert Guerra, and what we hope to do over the next hour is, as it was mentioned just a few moments ago, share our experience and tell you a bit of the World Summit on the Information Society and a review of what the wsis was, and particularly the issues that occurred with the recent summit in Tunisia. So our talk today is titled wsis to Review, Hacking a Dictatorship. What we're going to do over the course of the next hour is, for those of you who may not know what wsis or all these different acronyms mean, is give you a bit of context, give you an idea of what the wsis is about. We'll go into definition of some of the key concepts that occurred, particularly the issue of multi-stakeholder. Who's involved and how they interacted with each other, some of the key issues at play, and some of the politics involved, particularly on the two issues, internet governance, or who controls the internet, and the issues of financing. The specific experience that we had and the context that we found ourselves in regards to Tunisia, the repression that was experienced, the gross violations of human rights, and how some very creative individuals, very creative organizations, in a way, tried to hack the dictatorship to expose its faults, but also to push the envelope forward. We'll then talk about what's up next in regards to the World Summit on the Information Society, and then very importantly, what are some of the lessons that we learned in terms of our experience through this process. But also what are some things, some strategies that we learned perhaps from some very strange people that might be very useful in moving particular actions ahead. So I'm going to start, and what I'm going to do in terms of a background, so you have an idea of the context in terms of this the UN Summit, is, well, what is a UN Summit, and why was this created? The United Nations, created right after the Second World War, has had a series of conferences where different countries of the world, different citizens of the world come together to discuss a very specific theme. The very first conference of the United Nations was to define the United Nations, its rules, its procedures, set up all the different structures, and this was done in San Francisco. And then it said, well, we'll have a headquarters in New York, and so on. And then and they've had many meetings from there until now. But specifically in the 80s, there was a grand number of United Nations summits on human rights, on the environment, the Rio Summit perhaps being the one that most people might remember. The 90s, and a whole bunch of other ones as well. And it was in this very progressive, let's bring countries, individuals, organizations together to talk about the problems of the world. That's the main context that we find ourselves in. And then some 5 years ago, in the year 2000, the countries of the world basically said, we have some great issues in front of us, and over the course of the next 15 years and 30 years going forward, let's try to achieve some reduction of HIV/AIDS and things like that. And then while they were discussing, they realized that there was one big issue that a lot of countries in the world had, and that was the issues of the digital divide. There were some very technology-rich countries, Europe, Northern America, but countries like Africa and other parts of the world who didn't. And particularly the countries in Africa said, well, this is a big issue for us, and we can't solve it ourselves. And so let's convene a United Nations conference, a United Nations summit to discuss about this. And so that was set in motion, that was started, and the idea was to have a common vision of the information society, what some of the challenges were, and try to deal with the topics and go forward. That's the context, and we'll get into some of the specifics shortly. In terms of how this is organized, well, unlike us here where we can have a meeting and maybe we can discuss and resolve something maybe in a day or two, for countries to decide something takes a very long time. And so the World Summit on the Information Society, in order to get to the first summit, which was in 2003, it took them 3 years to get there. And so they have to have meetings to decide who can attend the meetings. They have to have meetings as to if people can speak and for how long and who can speak and who can go into the room. That takes about 2 weeks, but it takes 6 months to decide when that meeting is going to take place. So in order to get to that very first summit, took 3 years. And to the one that was just celebrated in November, took another 2.5 years as well. So there is a lot of meetings. And the way the United Nations tries to resolve this is before they have their big meeting at the end where everyone signs, is they have preparation meetings, so also called prepcoms. And they might have a meeting around a specific topic: cybercrime, security, ubiquitous computing, volunteers, and also Europe might have a meeting, Latin America might have a meeting, in Asia, and so on. So as you see in the slide, it's tons of meetings. And something that we'll talk about later is they couldn't really decide where to have one, so they decided to have two. And so the first one was in 2003, and it was basically about the grand vision, what this means, what are the principles of information society or for the world, what are some goals that we want to achieve for 2015 and beyond. And then afterwards is putting that into practice. What are specific things that we that can be done? And then in 2005, it was what was done, and what are the solutions that we can use going forward. So that's a little bit of the context. I'll now pass it over to Ralph, that will talk about, well, who was really there?
Yeah, maybe the main difference between the other previous UN summits and this specific summit is that the other summits were mostly reactions to specific problems, like the population growth in developing countries or environmental problems, climate change, whatever. So mostly their focus was more narrow and more trying to fix a problem in a way. And then you can start to negotiate how many carbon dioxide each country should be able to emit and stuff like that. This summit was a bit more difficult because it was of course, as Robert said, to work on a problem that they saw, the digital divide, but also, as Robert also said, to define a common global vision for the information society. And that's a bit more tricky. I mean, information society is just talking about a vision of society. That's a lot of different things to talk about. So that was one reason why they said from the very beginning, we can't do this as governments on our own. We need to involve all the societal actors, like the business sector who's producing most of the hardware and software and broadband connections and so on, and the civil society, the researchers in the labs and all kinds of other actors. So that's why they, from the beginning, called it a multi-stakeholder summit. Of course, the major actors still are and were the governments. In the end, it's the 191 or 2 member states of the United Nations who have to agree on a summit declaration, on the summit outcomes. And if they don't agree, nobody cares if the others agree or not. It's mainly the governments have to decide in the end. They are grouped in regions and other ways. There were a couple of gangs who would always stick together and come up with joint positions and fight the other gangs. Like the European Union was one gang, you could call them. The G77, the grouping of the 77 most important developing countries. And then some other groups, like the like-minded group, they call themselves, and so on. The summit was run by the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, who also was interested to get a bit away from the old telephone world and frequencies world and so on, and get more involved in the internet world, which they hadn't been before. And then the other actors were officially called observers. That's all the other UN agencies, United Nations Development Agency or UNESCO, all kinds of other UN agencies, but also other international organizations like the Council of Europe and so on. And then the business sector was represented as official observers. They were mostly coordinated through the International Chamber of Commerce. And civil society, that's us, so to speak, everybody else, everybody who's not government or business sector or international organization. And that was a hell of a lot of different people, as you can imagine. It was a ton of activists, like professional workers who work on grassroots level, who do telecenters in developing countries or run blogs, or people who run Wikipedia, like, things like that, people from the Free Software Foundation and so on. But also activists from totally different backgrounds, like who worked on environmental issues, on human rights, on totally different things. And it was, in a way, hard to come up with a joint language, so to speak. Yeah, and the interesting thing was the interaction between these different groups of actors. Yeah, next one. The ITU the whole time called it a new kind of summit because of this multi-stakeholder approach, because everybody should be able to at least participate a bit. So as I said, the governments in the end were the ones who could decide on the summit outcomes, but we had some rights, and they went further than in previous summits. We could observe most of the meetings, sit there and record them, and even distribute them, stream them or whatever, though most of the meetings were streamed by the ITU themselves. We had some rights to even speak in the official negotiations, which was sometimes really helpful. We could also submit written input, so if the governments were drafting a chapter of the summit declaration on privacy and internet security or something, cybersecurity, and we thought, probably they started drafting a paragraph on cybersecurity, and then we said, oh, you're forgetting about privacy here, we should add at least a sentence on privacy, and then we could submit language and suggest that it comes into the declaration, and sometimes we succeeded there also. And we could organize parallel events, which were often well attended, even by government people. And of course, once you are there and you hang out at these preparatory conferences and in the conference centers in Geneva and elsewhere, you of course meet a lot of people and talk to them in the hallways and have drinks with them afterwards and so on. What was a bit difficult, they more or less were very open to listening to us when they regarded us as experts, you know, when we could really tell these government bureaucrats what TCP/IP is, or, you know, how the domain name system really works and stuff like that. But once we started to act not just as experts, but as citizens, so to speak, who have specific political goals and interests that might contradict their own goals, it was a bit more difficult, of course, to get them to listen to us. But still, we could at least talk to them.
Okay, the main question of the WSIS was who controls the internet? It's a debate which wasn't the goal at the beginning. It's a debate about ICANN or ITU, how we learned 10 minutes before. The ITU is the International Telecommunication Union, and it's an UN organization for the telecommunication sector and doing standardization and such things. Yeah, and in the beginning of the WSIS, they were talking about bridging the digital gap, and after some months, a lot of countries put a new agenda or a new topic on the agenda, the internet governance stuff. And in the first summit 2 years before in Geneva, there was a big question, ITU or ICANN, who controls the internet? And going back in history, the ICANN is a non-profit organization based in California, and this non-profit organization runs the internet, or it controls the core resources of the internet. And it's not only a non-profit organization based in California. This non-profit organization is being controlled by the US economy minister, or what is the name? What? Department of Commerce. So you see, you can imagine there are a lot of countries in the world who don't like a non-profit organization running